Joining me now, Congressman Adam Schiff of California, chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, an impeachment manager in the first impeachment of the former president. And, you know, I don't know if you found the most disturbing aspect of this interview with Barr, the fact that he appears to have collaborated with the then Senate Majority Leader to try to use a DOJ investigation that went against policy to try to help Mitch McConnell hold on to the Senate by winning those two elections. That is how I read it. Is that how you read it?
That is how I read it, and it is astonishing that you have the Attorney General of the United States essentially conferring with a partisan legislative leader to try to direct the Justice Department in a way that will help either the GOP or the president. And you're absolutely right. He violated Department of Justice policy, and he did it repeatedly. He was even willing to let Durham announce his investigation results in the weeks leading up to the election in violation of another DOJ policy. And for him now to try to rehabilitate himself, there is no rehabilitation for Bill Barr. Not after what he did to the Justice Department, not after misleading the country for weeks and weeks with false claims of potential fraud in the election and fraud with absentee ballots. He was singing the president's song for a very long time. And the fact that he stopped singing it because he thought it would be more helpful to the party if he stopped when Mitch McConnell asked him, he gets no credit for that.
Well, and I think that is such an important point. It's not that he turned against the big lie because he knew it was wrong and that it was wrong for the president to approach him. Can you imagine a world in which Eric Holder had known that there was a highly unlikely that any evidence existed that, you know, the scales could be tipped in the election in 2012, and then conferred with Harry Reid, with Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, and said, but I'm still going to do the investigations anyway. And in Barr's case, he said he did it just because he knew that Trump would ask him. And he wanted to be able to say, we're working on it. I can't imagine how apoplectic Republicans and, frankly, the media would be if that had been Holder and Reid as opposed to Barr and McConnell. Can you?
No, I can't. And there's a whole long line of actions and misconduct by Bill Barr along those same lines. If you can imagine if Barack Obama had intervened in a sentencing of someone who lied to Congress to cover up for the former president, what the outcry would be. But that's what Bill Barr did for Donald Trump when he intervened in the Roger Stone case. He made the case against Michael Flynn go away. These are astonishing actions by an attorney general, purely political acts to placate, please the president of the United States. If any Democratic president did anything like that, there would be such a hue and cry about it. And so I don't think there's anyone in the modern history of the Justice Department who has done more damage to that institution than Bill Barr. And for him to now try to give these self-serving accounts, it's too late, Bill Barr, for you to think about your place in history. It is irrevocably tarnished.
The cover-up general was his nickname that William Safire gave him back in the 90s. I think it still applies. I want to let you listen to Senator Mitt Romney, because there's a thing that's happening among at least some Senate Republicans. I wonder if it's happening among House Republicans as well, where they, too, are doing some laundry, some reputation laundry. Here's Mitt Romney on CNN about the big lie, talking about the big lie.
I do think it's important for each person to speak the truth and to make clear that the big lie is exactly that. This is a bit like WWF, that it's entertaining, but it's not real. I think people recognize that it's a lot of show and bombast, but it's going nowhere.
And, you know, Congressman, that would sound good had he voted to even discuss the For the People Act. But he voted with all of the Republicans to bar even bringing discussion to the Senate floor to talk about protecting the American people from the big lie, which is being enacted basically every day in the states. Right now, we have 14 states that have enacted 22 laws that restrict the right to vote based on the big lie. Are you concerned that this big lie, no matter what Mitt Romney tries to say in his own defense, is now going to be the prevailing factor in the 2022 elections and beyond?
Well, I am certainly concerned with the use of the big lie to propel these state laws to disenfranchise people, and particularly people of color, as well to push these laws that would strip independent secretaries of state of their powers and give them over to someone appointed by partisan legislatures. What the Republicans seem to be doing around the country is, number one, trying to decide the election by making it hard for people of color to vote, and number two, if the election still goes against them, to position themselves to overturn it, to be successful in overturning it in a way that they were not successful in the last election. These laws are just all daggers pointed at the heart of the democracy, and anyone peddling the big lie is doing so at great risk to our whole system of checks and balances.
Yeah, indeed. One last thing, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, since I do have you here. We now have Speaker Pelosi having introduced a bill to establish this January 6th commission. I think very important for the country. There'll be 13 members. Speaker Pelosi can choose 8. She's seriously considering a Republican. The remaining 5 would be selected. And here's the hitch. After consultation with Kevin McCarthy, are you concerned that Kevin McCarthy will attempt to stack the commission and his 5 picks with people who were part of the big lie, people who supported the insurrection, maybe even some absolute Looney Tunes like Marjorie Taylor Greene, in order just to disrupt it?
Kevin McCarthy is capable of anything. He is purely a political animal. There's no ideology there except ambition, self-advancement. And so he's capable of anything. But at the end of the day, the investigation will go forward, no matter who he might choose to put on that commission, because we are determined to get to the truth.